The deepest furry fandom iceberg explained. If you've been following this series, you might have noticed that it's been a little while since the last upload, and you might notice that this one is a little shorter. That's because this layer I've actually cut in half, and I'm going to be doing in 2 parts, because life happened. But either way, let's go ahead and get into it. Furcadia. Furcadia is a community-based MMORPG centered on user-generated content. It separates itself from a lot of other online experiences due to being free-to-play since its launch in December 1996, with one of the creators, Dr. Cat, claiming that it was the first graphical free-to-play game released online to feature monetization as a means of keeping it running. It's also notable for being the first graphical experience online that centered entirely around Anthro characters, with users creating avatars that fall into one of several Anthro categories. The other primary developer for the game, Talzamir, has been on the project with Dr. Cat from the beginning, with the two and their team composing Dragon's Eye Productions, the company behind Furcadia. The two met while working at Origin Systems and split off to form their own games company in the early 90s, according to Dr. Cat, the first devs from Origin to do so. Dr. Cat was kind enough to provide an interview for this and Furcadia's predecessor, which we'll discuss in the future. Given how long Furcadia has been online, Dr. Cat noted that it's been updated over time from 8-bit art to full 32-bit color, with alpha support for lighting and translucency effects. Another notable feature about Furcadia that has existed since the beginning is the community-driven aspect. We've discussed VR chat, which is filled with user-created worlds, but Furcadia was implementing this concept 2 decades earlier, providing tools for users to create and add what are called dreams from the beginning. These can take the form of minigames, role-playing worlds, and more, and have offered the kind of creative expression afforded by Second Life or VR chat for even longer than either of those games have existed. In fact, in 2016, the Guinness Book of World Records awarded the game the title of longest-running social MMORPG. The game originally launched as a Windows 95 client, with Dr. Cat explaining that he paid for most of the development using his savings until the game was polished enough for launch. In its initial form, Dr. Cat wrote the code while Talzamir created most of the art and assets, with some help from Jeff D. Today, Furcadia is still online with the ability to play through the downloadable client or through a browser-based client, and it has an estimated user base of about 28,000 users, according to MMO stats. To this day, the game is updated, with a community support team running live events regularly. $50,000 Fursuit. This entry refers to the highest cost currently known publicly sold fursuit. The suit was a custom, designed and made by Zuri Studios, meaning that at the time of the auction on thedealersden.com, bidders weren't vying for an already existing suit. They were bidding on the opportunity to have their own fursona made into a fursuit by Zuri. Shortly after the sale in early 2021, Dogpatch Press was able to get in touch with the auction winner, Mist Dingo. Speculation on social media was that Mist had been using the win as a stunt to promote a then-new cryptocurrency, Come Inu, which was designed to be a safe payment method for sex workers who were being shut out by payment processors. About a month after the sale, Come Inu seems to have hit its peak at about 1/3 of a cent per coin, and ever since it hasn't been doing especially well. At the time though, Mist explained that they were simply promoting the token because they believed in it, and were in a position to drop $5,000 per week for 10 weeks to pay for the suit. Prior to Mist's passing away in August 2022, they were photographed multiple times donning their suit designed and built by Zuri Studios. At the time of the auction, the price tag on Mist's suit was a point of contention and, well, discourse. It more than doubled the previous record, $17,000 for a pre-made suit named Manuel by maker Mixed Candy, which itself came after a $13,500 custom auction by Made For You, and then a $11,500 Angel Dragon suit, all the way back in 2014. In other words, the title of the most expensive fursuit has been something that's been tracked by the fandom for about a decade, at least, with $50,000 being a huge milestone to have been surpassed, especially since that number was only reached after a fierce bidding war in the final minutes of the auction, jumping up nearly $20,000 right before closing. In the 2 years since, this number has not increased, as far as I can tell, to which many detractors would likely applaud. This whole incident takes the idea of the artist charging what they think their work is worth, and then being berated at asking for too much. But instead, this kind of puts the onus on the buyer. Many hot takes were to be had about the state of the fandom being pay to win or too expensive, but ultimately, it wasn't really Zuri's fault that the suit went for $50,000. Zweitesich. Continuing on with the intersection of fandom discourse and fursuits, we have another curious case. A maker by the name of Zweitesich. Apologies for mispronouncing that, I took Spanish in high school. And the concept of designer fursuits. The idea behind this brand, the name being German for second self, came from a maker named Albino Topaz, who was interested in the idea of a designer fursuit brand, similar to upscale high-dollar designer clothing brands. She announced the project back in 2019, with 3 partial suits being put on sale first: a lion, a borzoi, and a ram. Wikifur notes that several other individual suits have been produced, but the idea behind these 3, dubbed on their site as the current triad, was to make striking, artistic suits that stood out from the crowd. However, as one may have expected, these were not mass-produced suits. One of each was produced and sold relatively quickly, with the later suits being commissioned from Albino Topaz using the brand name. As this post on the subreddit Hobby Drama explained, the contention behind these suits was primarily the price tag. The unique style was not necessarily an issue, it was more that each suit was branded, a partial suit which didn't come with a tail, and that each of them cost about twice as much as a professional quality full suit, namely $6,000 US compared to the commonly expected $3,000, give or take. According to this post, at the time, a lot of furries took issue with all of this, because of how corporate the whole thing felt, leading to the original Twitter advertisements being removed. As of 2022, 7 suits are known to have been produced by the label, but their Instagram notes that they are not currently taking fursuit commissions. In other words, the world's self-proclaimed first designer fursuit brand could be seen as either a success or a failure, depending on who you're asking. Albino Topaz was interviewed by Dazed concerning the backlash, and she explained regarding the prices that the way I sold my earlier costumes was through auction, so I had never been the one to value them. One costume I sold at auction for $8,025 was 5 or 6 years old, and then I sold a head with nothing else for $4,000. So that gave me my price range. She went on to explain that a lot of the confusion was related to the branding in the first place, saying, "It looked like this corporation, but it was never a fully fledged company with backers or anything. It was just me trying to launch this fancy looking website for my art, you know?" Censorship Pandas. The Censorship Pandas are a furry cultural artifact which you've probably come across if you've browsed any older furry sites or even just Wikifur at any point. But perhaps you didn't know about their history. These little boingy boofs were created by Miss Mab, aka Ambar, I think that's how you pronounce it, author of Dan and Mab's Furry Adventures, a webcomic running since 1998 and inspired by Miss Mab's activities in Furcadia. In the About page for Censorship Pandas, Miss Mab explains, "As I browsed through the net, I realized that there were a lot of these adopt a dragon or adopt a fuzzy things where people would draw a picture, then have other people adopt it to put on their sites. Kinda a cutesy way of getting visitors. I had a couple once, but over time I took them down. I mean, other than saying, this is what I adopted somewhere on the net, what point was there to them? Then an idea hit me. Everyone is familiar with web ratings. Those are those things on a site that say whether or not they are PG rated or for mature people only. Of course, they tend to only come in that black box style. So I decided, why not combine the two? Miss Mab provides 3 versions of each panda on this page, with many sites over the years adopting them. Most prominently, perhaps, Wikifur, which instituted the pandas to describe any online topic, and uses these ratings in the quick facts section of many pages. Furry Turns You Gay. This one is a mostly joking meme entry which relates tangentially to the previous entry on fragile heterosexuality, where there we discussed the concept that it's easier to lose your status as heterosexual than any flavor of queer. This entry refers to the actual egg cracking. Like we discussed in that previous entry, furry allows the space for a lot of people to start asking questions of themselves that they may not otherwise have felt comfortable with, specifically where it relates to gender, sexuality, and so forth, given how open and generally accepting of a space it is. So what happens when you're someone who has never had any reason to identify as anything other than straight, and then you're put in an environment where that type of exploration is allowed, only to find out that, well, maybe you're not so straight? Well, you blame the fandom and claim that furry turned you gay, hence the meme. In fact, this is a common sentiment when you start asking furries about their self-expression and self-exploration. I found this article from as recently as February of this year, published by Pink News, with interviewees expressing that furry helped them find their identity much more easily than polite society would have. As we discussed in that previous entry as well, only roughly 20% of the fandom is composed of heterosexual furries, which could also explain some of this. The meme image of the fandom has long been that it's chock full of white cis gay men, which may have led to the idea that furry turns you gay. But at the end of the day, the fact is that 80% of the fandom is not straight, and you're definitely at risk for discovering some things about yourself if you engage with furry. FurScience. Speaking of that data we've referred to a few times now, let's talk about FurScience, a project which has spent more than a decade now working to study and explain furry to those inside and outside of the fandom alike. To quote from their homepage, FurScience is the public face of the International Anthropomorphic Research Project, IARP, studying furries and their fandom and disseminating our evidence-based research to furries, the general public, scholars, and the media to increase understanding and decrease stigma. FurScience released a book in 2016 titled FurScience, a summary of 5 years of research from the International Anthropomorphic Research Project, which included data from surveys and studies going back to 2011. But in the introduction of the book, they mentioned that the organization had been operating for a decade by 2016. The surveys which provide data typically are conducted online, though some studies have been related to specific in-person conventions over the years. And though this publication is almost a decade old at this point, their website was registered in 2015, and new research is periodically published on the site to this day. FurScience is another irreplaceable resource for the research and information present on this iceberg. And as more thinly veiled transphobic legislation is being introduced throughout America, which targets furries as a proxy for trans people, FurScience has kept up the effort to clarify and demystify the fandom for everyone. People who want to hold on to their negative misconceptions about the fandom might not like it, but what's published by FurScience is what the fandom actually looks like. Fur and Loathing. Hey, speaking of misconceptions about the fandom, Fur and Loathing refers to the 5th episode of Season 4 of CSI. No subtitle or anything, we're talking about the original series, with this episode airing all the way back in October 2003. This was an era prior to the centralization of the internet, and prior to the ubiquity of social media, prior to YouTube. Basically, it was like still the Wild West era of the internet in a lot of ways. In other words, while you might be able to research to your heart's content what furry is nowadays, with the seemingly endless resources and number of influencers you can find easily, when this episode aired, the fandom was only really known among non-furries by those who were already terminally online. So that's a pretty small sample size. So, while 20 years ago might seem like a long time for something as small as a single episode of a TV show to be appearing this high up on this iceberg, let me tell you, the damage and awareness that this single 40-minute episode of CSI did to the popular perception of furries was kind of a lot. In fact, this very episode is name-dropped all these years later, even by FurScience, as one of the focal points for negative attitudes toward furry that they're specifically trying to combat. Common criticisms of the episode over the year have involved how flimsy the portrayal of furry and furcons are, given that the episode involves a fursuiter being killed while attending a fictional Las Vegas furcon called Plushies and Furries Convention. The episode delves pretty heavily into the sexual aspect of the fandom, arguably to the point that that's all it focuses on. Additionally, as far as I could tell from my research, as is also common for a lot of uninformed furry media, they didn't really hire anyone with relation to the fandom. Somehow, the specter of this single episode of CSI has haunted the fandom for quite some time now, and it's important to remember that it's easily one of the, I would argue, worst representations of the fandom from a show that already felt like it was running out of ideas only 4 years in. On the opposite side, I've met at least one person who says that this episode was actually what made them discover furry and get into it in a positive way. So I guess it's not all negative, it just happens to be that a lot of people people seem to have spent a lot of time over the years trying to undo the damage to the popular perception of furry that this one episode did. Come to think of it though, this was released in October 2003, so we might have to do a little celebration for the 20th anniversary coming up. Therianthropy and Otherkin. This one refers to an incredibly broad, overarching subject that is very personal to each individual who uses either of these terms, and is often assumed to be synonymous with furry. Perhaps the two are tangentially related in that both gained a good amount of traction on Usenet, and both involved anthropomorphizing animals, but furry and therianthropy are definitely not the same thing, even if they have some overlap. As with the Fur and Loathing entry, we've seen how much effort people are willing to put into understanding niche subcultures like furry, so you can imagine that when two things vaguely look like they overlap, non-therians and non-furries will probably assume that they're basically the same thing. Anyway, what do these terms mean in the first place? I want to give a thanks to Diamante Fangs for helping me research this one, because they described it essentially as a feeling of being not just human. In other words, attributing aspects of yourself to other animals. They explained it can be spiritual. I'd say that's the case most of the time. And in fact, a lot of the times, based off of the research materials that they provided me, a lot of times when you see this overlap between therianthropy and furry, it is in a spiritual sense, where the person in question feels a spiritual connection to a particular animal. Therianthropy is similar to the term lycanthropy, which describes what we may also know as werewolves, where lycan means wolf and thrope means person. The term therianthrope, Greek for beast person, has been used as well for over 100 years now to describe folkloric characters. In the early 1990s, on a Usenet group set up to discuss werewolves, the term took on a new life to describe people who didn't literally transform into other creatures, but who find aspects of animals in their being. As this modern discussion began on a werewolf group, users often applied the term lycanthrope to themselves, but shifted rather quickly to the broader term of therianthrope, or Therian for short. The term Otherkin has also been around for several decades to describe basically the same phenomenon, even as far back as the early 1970s. This one being with a group who considered themselves spiritually linked to elves. In 1993, a similar Usenet group to the werewolf one was created, this time for the discussion of dragons. As with the earlier werewolf group, discussion eventually veered into talks of users' identities as dragons. One of the resources Diamante pointed me to, the Therian Guide, defines therianthropy as a person who experiences being and identifies as a non-human animal on an integral, personal level. While Otherkin doesn't have the exact same origins, the two terms in a lot of cases do seem to be used interchangeably at this point. The latter term derives from the idea of being kin to an animal or being other than human, a concept you've likely encountered more recently when people describe how much they relate to specific fictional characters, as in, I kin this character. It's like that, but with species of animals, whether they're real world or mythical. Many Therians experience what they call shifting, which is a mental or physical sensation of moving more toward their kin species than their human aspect. Again, the Therian Guide has a pretty comprehensive list of types of shifts, what they feel like, and the signs to look out for, as well as a guide explaining how Therians and Otherkin typically discover their status as such. Currently, this phenomenon isn't very well studied, from what I can see, by anyone outside of the community, meaning that the cause of therianthropy is still largely up for debate, with some claiming it as a sign of reincarnation, others stating it's likely due to brain chemistry, others seeing it as a sign of one's connection to nature, and so on. The number of theories is like literally endless on this. It's truly a fascinating, heavily misunderstood community that appears here because of its tangential relation to furry that frequently leads to confusion among those on the outside. What? I Think I'm an Animal. What I Think I'm an Animal is a 2013 TV documentary produced by Zigzag Productions for Logo TV, which has served as another source of misinformation, this time concerning both furry and therianthropy for a decade. This TV documentary prominently features Naya Okami, who spent a lot of time and effort in the years after this program's release to spread proper information about therianthropy, as well as Paradox Wolf, host of one of the oldest furry podcasts, and others. The main conceit of this documentary is that it follows a handful of young people who are either furries or Therians, interviewing them and their parents, and exploring their lives and what got them interested in these aspects of themselves. The main problem here is that the special treats everything presented as though it was played naturally, when in fact Naya has gone on record to explain that the majority of what was shown for her segment was staged. In a blog post concerning the special, she explained, "The term mockumentary is decidedly more accurate, both because it mocks the subjects it covers and because it fits the literal definition of a mockumentary." She then goes on to list a whole host of reasons she takes issue with the special, namely that it blurs the lines between Therian and furry, it focuses heavily on a polyamorous relationship between several other interviewees, implying that this is a common or integral part of the Therian experience, and the staging of one key sequence for her in particular. In this instance, she had set up a shoot at a wolf preserve, whereas the production team vetoed this and instead took her to a pet store and encouraged her to shop around. If you're curious about the whole experience from her perspective, definitely check out this blog post. And it's not just Naya who took issue with it. A 2013 survey of 120 Therians and Otherkin showed that 80% had an extremely negative view of how the special treated their community. I also had the privilege of speaking with Naya one-on-one, and she explained some other aspects of the production for me to share. She stated that, "I was the administrator of an Otherkin community called Wolf Howl at the time. If I recall correctly, the production team registered on the site and posted a casting call. I had initially banned the account and sounded an alarm about not participating in their production due to historical bad media representation of Otherkin and Therians in the past. I was then contacted by the team and originally asked to serve as a sort of reviewer or fact-checker, and then slowly cozied up into granting an interview and going on air. I was warned by the entire community not to do this at the time, but my dumb 18-year-old self saw myself as a leader and thought I was savvy enough to do it. Obviously, I was mistaken and I let the community down at this point, and made a fool of myself in the process." She went on to express disappointment that, "I specifically stated that Otherkin and furry were not the same thing. I did not expect furry to be involved, especially how much I spent differentiating the two communities on the pre-interview discussions with the production team." Lastly, Naya wanted to be clear that she no longer associates with the Therian community, and that those interested in learning about it would do better to research through sites and resources run by the community itself, rather than media like this TV special. I was also able to speak with Paradox Wolf, who identifies as both a furry and a Therian, and who served as the host of Furcast for 10 years. He explained to me, "I largely see that as a piece of my childhood. It was a cool experience, but ultimately quite detached from anything I'd wish to say or represent today. I learned a lot about how television often struggles to tell stories that are visually interesting, rather than reporting. Ultimately, the production company, contractors, and TV networks had nice people working at them, but they also had a job to do, and that job had nothing to do with valuing our vision of the world. I also think times have changed quite a bit in terms of accepting people's virtual identities and different types of relationships in the near decade since that aired. While what I Think I'm an Animal may not be quite as well remembered as Fur and Loathing, it definitely serves as another example of how dangerous this type of mainstream media representation can be, particularly for uncritical, uncurious minds consuming it." Mini-meet. If a FurCon is a large gathering at a convention center, and a fur meet is either a public meetup or a house party with a smaller but still sizable attendance, I bet you can guess what a mini-meet is. That's right, it's an even smaller meetup, once again, either public or at a private residence, for the purpose of furry networking and socialization. According to Wikifur, the term is generally used in the UK and usually refers to meetups with fewer than 20 people in attendance. Can anyone in the audience confirm or deny that? I'd be curious to see if it's a more common or widespread term than that, like if it's used in the US a lot, or whether there's a definite cap on the number of attendees for a mini-meet. One of the top results when you search for mini-meet on Google links to a 13-year-old fur affinity post of suitors meeting up at an IHOP in Missouri, and many of the listings on Wikifur are more than a decade old. This implies to me that either the term is no longer used very heavily, or it's antiquated due to furry being more popular and gaining more individuals per meetup. In other words, that mini-meets don't exist anymore. Either way, it's a term that you'll likely run into at some point, especially when looking into the history of the fandom. So, it's a good one to know even if it's a little ambiguous. PathOwOgen. This one is a meme from the Furries vs. Gamers TikTok war, which we covered previously. The PathOwOgen is a potent virus which turns those affected into furries. As such, it was of great importance for the gamers involved in the war to keep the PathOwOgen at bay and to avoid exposure. The wiki chronicling the conflict explains the PathOwOgen was especially dangerous for gamers, as those infected would have knowledge of their home country, Gamer Nation, and would thus be susceptible to sharing secrets if converted. The wiki lists those with low self-esteem, no dignity, or low intelligence as particularly at risk to infection, and most of the methods of infection detailed boil down to exposure to furries or furry content. Breaking kayfabe for a moment here, this is all obviously a joke and a meme, but I really believe that jokes and memes are incredibly powerful tools for explaining how people and groups experience and perceive the world. I find it fascinating that this dumb meme phrase, when spelled out explicitly, ends up reading pretty beat for beat like the entries before for Furry Turns You Gay and Fragile Heterosexuality. I wrote both of them before completing research on this one, and here we are with exactly what was going on there. Complete avoidance of furry media for fear of becoming a furry. Again, I get it, this is a joke, but there's a certain truth underlying this outlook on the furry fandom, that you must not, at any cost, interact with it lest you become a part of it. Also of note, just for clarity's sake, is that the PathOwOgen is listed as an alternative to the Uwualizer, likely due to some disagreements in the comments on the former's page. But PathOwOgen is definitely the term that I've heard more often, so sorry. This might be the newer term, but it gets the top billing. Podcasts. Numerous furry-related podcasts have popped up over the years, with some lasting only a year or so, and others lasting a decade or more. The first one I became aware of was Furcast, which ran from 2010 to 2020, and which was hosted by Paradox Wolf, from the documentary mentioned before, alongside Pharaoh and other revolving co-hosts. Furcast was not the first, with Notcast premiering 2 years prior in 2008. Notcast was renamed to Southpaws in 2018, and is still running today. Since these early examples, a number of other podcasts have come and gone, with subject matter varying wildly, but all of them being based centrally around the furry fandom, or at least the hosts' identities as furries. Heck, there's even an ongoing D&D podcast centered around furry that's already in its 5th season. Whatever your interest, if you're into furry and you're into podcasts, you're likely to find something worth checking out if you just search this tag. The Internet Furry Proximity Locator. This is a tool that I learned about due to its frequent suggestion on early episodes of Furcast, where listeners would write in asking for direction on how to find furries, and the IFPL would be brought up. The idea is that you signed up for the IFPL, then you would find other furries close by, because you would put your address, essentially. The service went live all the way back in 1995, and has been hosted since by creator Posicat. While social media has mostly taken over at this point for finding furries close by for meetups and events, the IFPL was truly ahead of its time. Furries are always on the cutting edge of technology, and this is no exception, as I'm sure plenty of meetups and probably even long-term friendships sprung up because of this program. Skiltaire. The Skiltaire is an original species created by fandom founding father Mark Merlino, which he used as far back as university as a mascot character. He explained to me that later he used a Skiltaire as the hostess of video rooms he ran at conventions. A piece of art of one of his earliest individual Skiltaires, Theta, caught the eye of Steve Galacci at Boston Worldcon, sparking a conversation between the two regarding Anthro characters. This interaction helped lead to the founding of the fandom proper. Later, Fred Patton and other founding members of the Cartoon and Fantasy organization, which was something of a precursor to furry in certain ways, requested that Mark make a new Skiltaire as a group mascot, at which point he created 2. Fanta, and Psy, the latter of which he still uses as a fursona to this day. This was because other members of the CFO began calling Mark Psy, so the name just kinda stuck. The Skiltaire is something like an extraterrestrial mustelid, inspired by Mark's childhood love of otters, which was inspired by the Disney true life adventure, Beaver Valley. As a teenager, Mark was disappointed that all extraterrestrials in the science fiction that he found were depicted as humanoids, and instead envisioned an animal-based alien species. In the decades since, Mark has used the Skiltaire to brand almost everything with which he's been involved, frequently drawing them to promote conventions, to adorn Christmas cards, and so on. Truly, the Skiltaire is effectively the first original species of the fandom, and as such, has a very special place within furry. Morenatsu. Morenatsu is a series of visual novels which follows a human named Hiroyuki as he returns to his home village and encounters a group of Anthro characters, most of whom he grew up with, and all of whom are dateable. The first iteration of the game arose from a thread on 2channel all the way back in early 2003. Through a series of management changes and hangups, the original game was delayed multiple times until it was finally released between 2010 and 2011, with the project halting in 2013 before being discontinued in 2015. Despite the amount of time spent in development, and that the game was released originally in Japanese, several fan-made spin-offs have cropped up in the years since. The most prominent, perhaps, is Homecoming, Morenatsu Revisited, which began proper development in 2017, when Zondragon initiated the project with Stormsinger Studios. The game changed directors in 2019, when Frostclaw took over, then again in 2021, when Zondragon took over once again. Frostclaw spoke with me for this entry about the game's development history. The game is ultimately a reimagination of the original game, meaning that there has been some controversy over the years, perhaps most prominently regarding the player character being turned into an Arctic fox rather than a human, though this was later made a toggleable choice. Another common point of contention was the changes in art style, which Frostclaw explained were necessary due to the amount of new assets required to complete the game, as well as the difference in art styles utilized by those artists working on Homecoming. Despite this controversy, Frostclaw and the others attached to the project are longtime fans, with Frostclaw saying that he found the original Morenatsu in 2007, and that he's followed it since. Currently, Homecoming is in active development and can be downloaded from Stormsinger's website. This only touches on a decent amount of the information that Frostclaw explained to me about the various iterations of Morenatsu over the years, and he probably summed it up best at the end of our conversation when he said, "Morenatsu is kind of an iceberg inside of an iceberg." Albany Anthrocon. Albany Anthrocon was the precursor to the modern convention we know as Anthrocon. For the 2 years prior to Uncle Kage becoming the chairman and moving the convention, Anthrocon was hosted in Albany, New York. As we discussed previously, Uncle Kage moved the convention so that it had more opportunity to grow, and because Valley Forge and later Philadelphia were closer to where he lived at the time. Similarly, Albany was selected as the original home for Anthrocon due to it being the location of the original convention's staff and founder, Aloyen Youngblood. In fact, the convention initially germinated from the Halloween parties hosted by Youngblood in Albany, which reportedly became so popular that he proposed the idea of turning the gathering into a convention. The first, and only, 2 editions of Albany Anthrocon were hosted at the Omni Albany Hotel during 4th of July weekend in 1997 and 1998, with reported attendance numbers around 500 and 600 people, respectively. Ian Curtis. Ian Curtis is remembered as one of the most prominent founders of the furry fandom in the UK, as well as a well-known wargamer. Polly Kidd, who we'll be discussing shortly, explained to me that Curtis discovered the fandom in the late 1980s thanks to 2 comics, Albedo Anthropomorphics and Critters, both of which are remembered as influential comics within the fandom. Polly explained to me that the 2 of them exchanged letters beginning in 1986, and then they finally met at Boston Worldcon in 1989. No, it's not the same one where Galachi and Merlino met. That was in 1980. I really was confused about this initially. In the early 1990s, Curtis began hosting small gatherings at his residence in the UK, which were referred to as housecons, with one of the first being known affectionately as UK Microconference 0. Polly explained to me that in 1993, some fans were planning a housecon which was unfortunately flooded out, at which point Curtis offered his home as a venue. This particular housecon played host to not only influential members of the fandom, like Polly Kidd, but also Terry Pratchett, who Polly was working with at the time, among others. While these housecons never reached attendance numbers in the hundreds, they're an integral part of UK furry history, providing a much-needed entry point for many UK and European furries to get into the fandom, and offering many a networking opportunity for international fans. Flera notes that prior to his passing in 2021, Ian Curtis hosted fur meets all the way up until 2019, and that the only thing that stopped them was the pandemic. While this name might not be familiar to many Americans, Ian Curtis was truly one of the most important figures in the international fandom. Furry Network. Furry Network is a social network for furries founded in 2015 following the acquisition of Fur Affinity by social media network IMVU. The site is administered by Varka, CEO of Bad Dragon, who also owns E621 and F-List. In the original post announcing Furry Network, Varka explained that it was designed as a way to give back to the fandom's artists, and to provide the fandom with the community they deserve. At the time, the community lamented that a new social media site headed by Bad Dragon staff may set the fandom back with regards to the stigma that furries are just a bunch of horn dogs. The site operates as an art-driven social network where users can post and share visual art and writing. Perhaps the most notable feature is the commission section, where users can host and purchase commissions in an enclosed system. Often commissions are handled directly through payment processors like PayPal, when commissioning an artist through their personal website or a social media site like Instagram or Twitter. On Furry Network, however, there's an entire system in place for searching commissions using a number of criteria, thus streamlining the process for both artists and buyers. SoFurry. SoFurry is another furry social media site, though it's a bit older than Furry Network, being founded in 2009 by Tomol, but it has a similar focus on art. SoFurry was actually originally an extension of Tomol's previous site, Yiffy Story Archive, aka Yiffstar, which started as, well, a story archive in the early 2000s, but it expanded into more. SoFurry hosts both adult and non-adult content, further diversifying what Yiffstar offered. As with other sites of this type, SoFurry centers itself around art, hosting multiple media like visual arts, writing, photos, and more. In a 2015 interview with the South Afrifur podcast, Tomol explained that in spite of this diversification, SoFurry is first and foremost a story-based website. APAs and fanzines. APA is short for Amateur Press Association, and fanzine is short for fan magazine, respectively. These are two types of small press, or independent publications that were vital to the early development of furry. Zines and APAs have existed for a long time, and in the 1970s through the 2000s in particular, the wave of interest in them intersected with furry, especially in the pre- and early internet era. The primary difference between the two terms is that APAs are generally made up of contributions from members, who then compile their works into a bound volume and produce enough copies for all contributors. Fanzines, on the other hand, are generally produced at a slightly larger scale, with enough copies to sell for fans of a particular interest. Some prominent APAs and zines that were influential in furry include Voodie, Rauerbrazel, and Yarf. We'll be diving into these a bit more in the future, but to put it simply, these three publications in particular pulled together some of the most influential members of the early fandom to produce art and stories based around anthropomorphics to share with one another. While Voodie was fairly short-lived, and Yarf lasted about a decade, Rauerbrazel has been running consistently since 1984, seeing quarterly publication and having surpassed 150 issues as of 2021. These types of publications were largely replaced by the internet, as their function was replaced by art sites like those mentioned previously, that function being providing specifically furry art to furry fans easily. As such, many APAs and zines have dried up over the years, but they served a vital function in decades past for providing this type of art as well as connecting furry fans around the world. Dogbomb. Dogbomb was a well-known, beloved fursuiter who was active in veterinary work as a registered technician and marathon running, as well as being the first recipient of the Good Furry Award in 2019. This was due to his contributions to the fandom and his work raising money for ALS research, a disease with which he was diagnosed in 2018 and of which he passed away in 2019. Dogbomb is rightfully known as a force of positivity in the fandom and as a face for the fandom to those outside of it. Honestly, there is a lot more to say about him, but this article right here, published by Dogpatch Press following his passing, says a lot more than I would probably be capable of. So honestly, they said it better. Go check this out if you want to learn more. ConFurence 0. ConFurence 0 was the first proper furry convention, hosted in 1989 on January 21st and 22nd at the Holiday Inn in Costa Mesa, California. With 90 registered members, the attendance numbers are cited at 65 people, though it's been noted that about 30 of those attendees fell ill of a flu almost immediately upon arrival. The idea behind ConFurence 0 was to transition the sci-fi convention room parties, hosted by Mark Merlino, Rod O'Reilly, and others, into a full-blown convention. This particular event played host to some of the long-standing traditions of even modern furcons, namely the charity auction, which in this case raised more than $1,000. In the con book for ConFurence 10, Rod O'Reilly reflected on the first convention, writing that the first one was named ConFurence 0 rather than ConFurence 1, as it was considered a dry run, and that the second iteration was to be the first real year of the convention. A lot of the initial promotion for ConFurence 0 occurred in fanzines and APAs, and ConFurence 0 didn't have a proper guest of honor. As O'Reilly explains, back then we had no idea who would be thought of as a well-known furry. In one of the letters penned prior to the convention for the purpose of soliciting interest, the organizers argued that ConFurence 0 was intended as a meeting place for like-minded people, which would help legitimize animal-based characters in all media, as well as shake the trees a bit. The same letter ends with a description of ConFurence 0 as a DIY convention. Well, you could say that's just what it did, and that's a fairly apt description of what the fandom was from that point forward. ConFurence ended up running for 15 years, ending in 2003 with ConFurence 14. Insect Anthros. This is a really quick one, but we've talked about furries, scalies, avians, fishies, and now we have, well, this one doesn't even seem to have a lot of popular contenders for what it should be called. There's a Wikifur article related to all invertebrate anthro characters, but that article doesn't even list options for what to call them. It merely states that they exist and offers a handful of prominent examples. So what do you even call, like, arthropod anthros? A Reddit post from 7 years ago suggests skellies, like exoskeleton, or crawlies, like creepy crawlies. Others offer buggies or chitonies. There seems to be a good amount of discussion as to whether arthropods count as furries, as there was with birds, reptiles, and fish, but there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of discussion on what they're actually called. So, just like the other types mentioned before, don't forget that buggies, or whatever you prefer, do exist. My question for any of y'all out there though, what do you prefer to be called? Albedo Anthropomorphics. We previously mentioned Steve Galachi as a prominent early member of the furry fandom, but we didn't delve very much into his most prominent work, often considered the first furry comic, Albedo Anthropomorphics. As we discussed, the comic arose from an idea originally called Astroduck, which would have been inspired by duck dodgers in the 24th and a half century, but it quickly grew into an original property which stars Irma Felna, an Anthrocat officer in the Extraplanetary Defense Force. Galachi was a military illustrator in the US Air Force, which influenced the comic being a hard sci-fi military thriller, wrapped up in interplanetary politics. The original comic run lasted 14 issues, between 1983 and 1989, under Galachi's company, Thoughts and Images. The comic halted then due to, as Galachi put it, any number of things, including getting a house and large yard in need of some substantial work, and getting married and stuff like that. It was then continued in 1991 as The New Albedo, under Antarctica Press, where it ran for 10 issues until 1993, where it was followed by a full-color issue in July 1993. In between, 3 issues of a fanzine known as Refractions were produced, though very few scans of these exist online, seeming like they're pretty elusive. Another volume of Albedo, this one titled Steve Galachi's Albedo Anthropomorphics, ran for 4 issues between 94 and 96. Another 2-volume issue was published by Antarctica Press between 97 and 99, followed by a 5th and final, to date, volume. This one also 2 issues, published in 2004 and 2005, and this time by Shanda Fantasy Arts. As we discussed in the section on Galachi himself, this volume was cut short when his wife was diagnosed with cancer. He explains on his site that at the time he was working on the 3rd issue for this volume, but this and all other projects of his were cancelled abruptly. Over the years, 4 individual tabletop games based on the series were released. The first 2 in 1988 and 1991. Being a 1st and 2nd edition of the same game, with the sourcebooks being penned by Polly Kidd and the art being drawn by Steve Galachi. The 2nd edition is also noted to include additional written material by Craig Hilton. In 2004, a new version of this RPG system, Platinum Catalyst, was written by Peter Van Triel and Jason Holmgren, and released by Sanguine Games. As of now, the 1st edition of the original game and Platinum Catalyst are available on DriveThru RPG for purchase. Additionally, the 4th one, a miniatures-based wargame known as Albedo Combat Patrol 164, was kickstarted in 2018 by Sally Forth, with updates to the game as recently as 2021. Though these handful of games may be of particularly niche interest, the influence of the comic from which they sprung cannot be understated. I want to thank you all for watching another installment of the Furry Fandom Iceberg. Part 5.5, or whatever you want to call it, will be coming sooner than later. I promise this will not be another month and a half wait, so stay tuned for that. I'm also curious, do you prefer these shorter uploads that might happen more frequently, or do you prefer the, hour-long, once-a-month uploads? I want to give thanks this time to Dr. Cat, Diamante Fangs, Naya Okami, Paradox Wolf, Mark Merlino, Frostclaw, and Steve Galachi for their help on research for this layer. That's going to do it this time, everybody. If you don't already, please like the video and subscribe to see all of my other nonsense on this channel. Don't forget to follow me over on Twitch. Alright, thanks. Bye.